For those of us who've had the opportunity to sit at the feet of Brother Jeff Miller, we're thankful. The opportunity to hear the gospel presented to us in such a way that sometimes we may not have the knowledge, tools, or ability to understand is a blessing within itself. And we cherish these moments. If you are not able to be here, all lessons are online. They've been recorded. I would encourage you to please go out and listen to those. There's so much information there on Genesis alone, the creation, the flood. To be honest, I was overwhelmed. There's so many things that will be brought to your attention that you may have never thought about. Tower of Babel and other things. Again, I would encourage that. This morning, Dr. Miller will again be leading us in Bible study. I will introduce more in depth when we have the worship service this morning. But right now, we'd like to approach our Father in prayer. So if you bow with me. Our Heavenly Father, it is so humbling to be able to approach you. Knowing you, you're all-powerful, almighty, creator, judge of all things. We're thankful to be here this morning in this building as the church gathers to worship you, to study your word, to commune with you, and to hear lessons brought to us that will give us better understanding of not only your expectations of us, but what you've done for us, the sacrifices that you've made. From the beginning, it was intended that your Son would give up his life for us, the perfect lamb, the perfect sacrifice, so that one day we can enjoy the comforts of the kingdom if we're obedient to your will. Pray that you'll be with Dr. Miller this morning as he presents the word to us. Pray that we'll have an open and attentive heart, and that we'll learn from this, better deepen our knowledge of you. Be with us this morning. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Okay, a lot to cover this morning, so we're going to jump right in. 1 Peter 3:15 tells us we're to always be ready to give an apologion, which is where the word apologetics comes from. To give a defense is the idea, and that's what we're looking at doing in this session this morning. And so last night we began looking at this debate that happened 12 or 13 years ago between Bill Nye, the pseudoscience guy, and Ken Ham, and it was on whether or not the biblical creation model is a legitimate model or not. And so we're looking today at the question of whether it's a robust model. Can it withstand scrutiny? In that debate, Bill Nye brought up several points that really deserved a good shake, a good answer. And Ken Ham really did not, I feel like, do a good job dealing with several of those points. So I wrote an article reviewing this debate, and I brought several copies that are available for free out there on the free table looking at this debate. But let's go ahead and look at some of the points that Bill Nye made that I thought were good points that deserve some scrutiny. He said, if the creation model is true in the Earth is only 6,000 to 8,000 years old, then how is it that we have hundreds of thousands of years worth of accumulation of ice layering in the ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica? How do you have trees that are even older than the flood and even creation in some cases, living trees? How do you have civilizations with histories that go back not only beyond Babel, but even older than the flood in some cases? How do you get creatures to Australia if they all get wiped out in the flood? How do you get them from the ark to places like Australia after the flood? How do you get from a relatively few number of species on the ark, say 7,000, to the 16 million species we have today and do it in only 4,000 years? That'd be 11 new species emerging every day over that time period. And there's not even enough space on the ark for that 7,000 species. How is the ark big enough? And then how would you even have a vessel the size of the ark and it be seaworthy when we have a modern example of a big wooden vessel, the Wyoming, that ultimately sank on the open seas due to the tendency of its long planks to twist and buckle and ultimately cause leakage, and it sank. So let's in this class go ahead and go through these 7 challenges to the creation model. All right, number 1, how do we have hundreds of thousands of years documented in the ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica? First of all, we need to understand what an ice core is. This is where meteorologists will drill down into the ice caps and pull up these long tubes of ice, and you notice there's these layers in them, and they correspond to annual layers being accumulated. And so he says, if you got hundreds of thousands of these, then how is the earth not hundreds of thousands of years old? So how do we respond to that? Well, we've spent a lot of time this weekend setting up the biblical creation model that you have to be able to do to then see whether it can withstand challenges. And so we talked a lot about uniformitarianism, which is the idea that whatever we see going on today, whatever rates and processes we see going on today, we assume it's always been that way in the past. We don't see global floods happening today, so you assume that never happened. Whatever you see going on today is assumed to have gone on throughout time, and so it is with the accumulation of ice. If it is possible for more than one layer of ice to accumulate in a single year, then it would destroy the assumption that these ice cores are documenting hundreds of thousands of years. And sure enough, that evidence exists. When you have even individual storms and cyclical weather patterns, it can cause layers that resemble annual layers. And when you take into account that the flood model includes the necessity of an ice age following the flood, then the circumstances are just right for multiple subannual layers accumulating each year in the glaciers. In fact, as many as 1,000 annual cycles in 1 year. On top of that, modern estimates for ice accumulation in Greenland are less than 1 foot per year. That's what we see happening today. But has that estimate really held throughout time? Well, no, because even in modern times, we have evidence of rapid deposition of ice rather than uniformitarian deposition. For example, in 1988, ground-penetrating radar was used to discover the location of some abandoned World War II planes from 1942 in Greenland. And surprisingly, the planes had been buried under more than 260 feet of ice and snow. Now that's over 5 feet of ice accumulating every year for 46 years rather than less than 1 foot per year. So even in modern times, uniformitarian estimates for ice layer accumulation doesn't coincide with actual observable evidence in many cases. So Bill Nye's use of ice cores to prove an old Earth simply doesn't hold ice under scrutiny. Number two, he argued there are trees like bristlecone pine trees alive today that are as old as 6,800 years, and even a Norway spruce tree called Old Chico that's 9,550 years old. If so, these trees would have had to survive the flood and possibly even precede creation week, which would seem to be a major problem for the creation model. So first of all, we need to understand how they're dating these trees, and so you need to understand what's called dendrochronology. Dendrochronology is a study of tree rings, not just to find the age of trees, but it can actually tell you things about climate in the past, how much rainfall there was, whether there were droughts and so forth. But today, we see generally one ring forming each year, so annual accumulation of these tree rings. So he mentioned old bristlecone pine trees that are 6,000 to 7,000 years old. By the way, I have an article we just released this year where I go really in depth into this whole tree ring question, if you want to dig into this more on our website. Now we need to ask Bill Nye, though, what bristlecone pine tree is he talking about? Because which he doesn't say. He just throws out there bristlecone pines. We got some that are alive that are that old. And I would say that the first thing you need to do whenever skeptics come at you with these kind of questions is make them prove their point. What are you talking about? What tree are you referring to? Because the oldest living bristlecone pine was discovered in 2012, and it dated as 5,062 years old, not 6,800. And it was using tree ring counting, but also cross dating. And that means it would have started, if it's 5,062 years old, it was started growing around 3000 BC. So is that a problem for the creation model? Well, it sounds like it if you have a tree older than when the flood was supposed to occur. The biblical model places the flood as recent as 2300 BC, based on the chronologies of Genesis 11 coupled with history. That would be about 4,300 years ago. But there's room to expand that number by several years in the chronologies of Genesis 11, which I alluded to yesterday. and we have an article on our website on that. So this already eliminates the problem that Bill Nye has brought up. But consider also that once again, uniformity is assumed counting these tree rings. They're assuming one ring forming per year. And we know today that rings don't always correlate with single years. In fact, it happens a lot, as I talk about in this article. Sometimes rings form subannually. So when you have time staggered, repeated disturbances caused by unusual weather, that has been shown to severely affect tree ring patterns. And again, when you take into account that in the post-flood ice age, that is the kind of conditions you have going on, you would expect subannual tree rings to be accumulating during those first few hundred years after the flood. So it's very possible the bristlecone pines are really several years younger than they appear. So where did he get 6,800 as opposed to 5,062? Well, it's unclear. Did he misspeak? Did he intentionally give information that just wasn't true? Is he actually referring to dead trees, not living trees, that have been cross-dated? This is where dendrochronologists will successively overlap tree ring patterns from living, even dead, and petrified trees to try to get a tree history back into the past. And what you find is when you look into cross-dating, this is an imprecise and often even subjective form of trying to date trees, because we have trees living today in the same forest whose tree ring patterns don't match, even though they're growing right there close to each other, because this is a complicated equation involving the distance the tree is from its water source, the direction the sunlight's hitting it, soil nutrients, where it is, storm patterns, and so forth. But they argue you can get a date for trees, a tree history back over 8,000 years, which again would sound like, okay, well that's beyond when creation even would be. But notice it's only potentially a problem if you assume all trees could not survive the flood. Now that would be an assumption. The text says all flesh died that moved on the earth. It doesn't refer to the plants. Is it possible that some areas of the planet had less disturbance? Some trees could have been more robust due to the optimized nature of the pre-flood environment. Bert Craig of the Department of Horticulture and Forestry at Michigan State highlighted that there are many tree species that can survive months underwater in flooding conditions. Horticulturalists Whitlow and Harris produced a monumental work on the effect of flooding on trees, and they documented dozens of species that are able to survive deep flooding for an entire growing season, even for more than 1 year, being in flooding conditions. So if trees survive the flood, either because they survive being underwater or because even they might have been brought on the ark in some cases, then trees with over 6,000 rings wouldn't be a problem. Now that said, even if cross-dating could legitimately take you back thousands of years further than the flood and even further than creation. Remember, one of the key aspects of the creation model is that God would have created the universe with an appearance of age, a mature universe. So for example, Adam and Eve are not zygotes when he makes them. They're already old enough to be able to subdue and have dominion over the earth, which is what he tells them to do in Genesis 1. Procreate, they're supposed to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Adam can tend the garden. They're able to understand God's prohibition about the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So all of this, even though they had just been created, you would expect starlight from distant stars to already be in place, because Genesis 1:14 tells you that the purpose of that starlight is for humans to be able to tell signs, seasons, days, and years, so you need that in place. It's possible that there were both daughter elements and parent elements in any rocks, giving them an immediate appearance of age. And I also mentioned yesterday, you would expect tree rings in the trees of the garden, for example, because they would have to be fully mature trees, already bearing fruit in order for Adam and Eve to be able to eat from these trees, which means you would expect tree rings, because the purpose of tree rings isn't to tell us the age of a tree. They provide strength to a tree. If you have a fully mature tree, it's got to have tree rings in order to give it the strength it needs to be able to not fall over, right? It needs that strength. That's the purpose of those tree rings. So tree ages really can't even be conclusively known. due to, in the case of these older trees, due to the potential for subannual tree rings as well as the mature creation idea. Now, what about the one tree that he actually gave a specific example for, and that was Old Chico, which he said is 9,550 years old. Now, what you need to understand about Old Chico is it actually used carbon dating, not dendrochronology. So it's typically not even listed among the verified oldest trees because of what I talked some about yesterday. That is, carbon dating is notoriously imprecise and suspect beyond a few thousand years. It's pretty good back to about 1,000 to 1,500 BC. But beyond that, there are major problems, in large part because of its foundational assumptions, some of which include the assumption concerning the effect of the Earth's magnetic field on the production rate of C14, and the assumption that the ratio of C14 to C12 in the atmosphere has remained constant throughout history, which scientists now reject. Archaeologist Brian Fagan of UC Santa Barbara even came out and said carbon dating is not infallible. In general, single dates should not be trusted. So tree ages just can't be used to disprove the creation model. All right, number 3, according to Bill Nye, there are human populations that are far older than that, talking about the flood and Babel, with traditions that go back farther than that. So if that's true, then that would seem to contradict the biblical text, because all civilizations are supposed to have been annihilated in the flood and ultimately only begin after Babel, after the flood. So only those civilizations that emerged after that point should have these distinct traditions. Well, again, we should ask, what civilizations was he talking about? He wasn't specific, so we're left to guess and make his arguments for him, which you wouldn't actually want to do in a debate. But is he referring to China? Records go back to about 1600 BC, and it's only uncorroborated legend before that. Chinese history can't be said to pose a problem. Is he talking about Sumer? 2700 BC is the date for the earliest known Sumerian king. The Sumerian language is said to be the oldest written language. It's claimed to date back to 3100 BC, but you got to keep in mind, again, these are based in large part on things like carbon dating to get these dates. But even with that, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, the chronology of the first half of the third millennium is largely a matter for the intuition of the individual author. Carbon-14 dates are at present too few and far between to be given undue weight. Consequently, the turn of the fourth to third millennium is to be accepted with due caution and reservations as the date of the invention of writing. So even the date 3100 BC is acknowledged to be speculative, and even if it's right, it actually still falls after possible flood date estimates, which can be as high as 3500 BC or more. What about Egypt? Scholars consider 3100 BC to be the commencement of the first Egyptian dynasty, and again, that can't be known conclusively for the same reasons as Sumer, due to the inexact nature of tree ring dating, pottery comparisons, C14 dating, and historical records. So some scholars believe that date can be collapsed a few hundred years into the 2000s BC, but either way, all of these dates from China, Sumer, and Egypt can fit within the biblical model. So bottom line, Bill Nye's claims don't carry any weight on this. They don't disprove the Bible, but I do notice an interesting pattern. The oldest living tree dates back to about 3100 BC. The Egyptian dynasty goes back to about 3100 BC, the first Egyptian dynasty. The origin of the written language in Sumer goes back to about 3100 BC, with no verifiable civilizations before that time. That's exactly what you would expect if the flood in Babel occurred. Something significant seems to have happened immediately prior to that time period. So I would argue that the post-story of the flood is being verified from multiple independent directions. Number 4, this is a big one that people bring up very regularly. If there was a flood, how do you get animals to Australia after they leave the ark? I mean, Australia is way out there, away from any continent. Any animal that was left on the continent before the flood should have been wiped out by the flood. So how did the animals get out there to Australia from the ark after the flood? All right, well, by the way, we just released an article on this in the last month or so too, where I explore this very in depth as well. Number 1, keep in mind, if this is a problem for creationists, guess who it's also a problem for? I mean, it's just as much a problem for evolution as how do you get animals to Australia, period. So they don't argue that they had their own single-celled organism that sprang into existence and turned into kangaroos out there. They've got to get animals out there as well. So whatever argument they use, why wouldn't the same argument be valid for creationists? Number two, Bill Nye summarily dismissed the idea of a possible land bridge from Asia to Australia. But actually, when you look closely at the geography there, you see there's islands all along the path from China to Australia, and the water between those islands is misleading. It hides what's under there. This is a map of the Pacific Sea floor showing that the continental shelf of China actually reaches all the way down to the continental shelf of Asia with only a relatively small gap between the two. Okay, and so whenever you consider, once again, what the creation model actually argues, you've got this post-flood ice age, so you got a lot more ice at the poles that lowers the sea level of the entire planet, which uncovers a lot of this area in between here, which is actually relatively shallow. And so it could be that that whole shelf reached down much closer to Australia in this direction as well as this direction, right? That entire shelf could have been free during that Ice Age Babel period. Another option, remember the creation model doesn't have a problem with the idea of Pangea. We would expect that. I think that's what's probably being alluded to in Genesis 1, verses 9 and 10. The idea that all the continents were at one point together in the pre-flood world, and then they broke up. The continents broke apart at the beginning of the flood, so talked about that yesterday as well. And so the implication there is that these continents would have been much closer together immediately after the flood, but there's been a lot of rapid plate movement during and immediately after the flood for a period of time there. And again, we looked at that yesterday and even showed scientific evidence of that. Interestingly, by the way, recent research by some Yale University geologists provides evidence for creationist claim that the continents did move much faster in the past. They are recognizing at least 3 times faster than they do today. We'd say a lot more than that. But here's what they say. These observations suggest that either non-uniformitarian plate tectonics, or in other words, more like catastrophic, not uniformitarianism, or an episode of rapid true polar wander occurred during the Cambrian explosion of animal life. We talked yesterday about what that is to creationists. That's the beginning of the flood. The Cambrian explosion is very clearly the beginning of the flood in the fossil record. And so, again, they're highlighting the fact that it looks like the plates did move a lot faster, and interestingly, right when the flood started, is what we would say. So if the continents were much closer together at this point, it would have been easier for creatures to get to places that are now a lot more remote than they were then. But there's other options as well. It's possible that the post-flood ice age would have allowed migration across certain frozen channels. We know, for example, that the English Channel was frozen during the ice age. Another plausible option is there would have been no doubt the dead pre-flood forests floating on the receding waters of the earth for some time after the flood, which would have made land masses for travel across channels. This, for example, is a picture from 2012 of Spirit Lake near Mount St. Helens. This is 32 years after the big 1980 eruption, and this floating log mat is still there today. Now, this is an image from the Telegraph, a popular newspaper out of the United Kingdom, and notice the title of the article for this picture, Massive Floating Rubbish Islands from Japan Tsunami Spotted on the Pacific. So you've got this catastrophic event, this major tsunami in Japan. It creates an island of trees and debris. And here's a shot of this island floating across the Pacific towards the U.S. West Coast. And this particular debris island is 69 miles long. It covers an expanse of over 2.2 million square feet. All right, now notice this picture, and in the description it explains that members of the Japan Coast Guard found and rescued this dog from a debris island from that tsunami 3 weeks after the tsunami. So this dog is out there on this island for 3 weeks and it survives that whole time. So it's not at all outlandish to suppose that massive debris islands would have been found worldwide after the flood, and that animals might have been found on these islands, floating to different places during the dispersion period. And as added evidence of the legitimacy of that theory, recent genetic analysis suggests that the marsupials, like the kangaroos over in Australia, originated in South America before they moved over to Australia, and they argue that it's by rafting they probably got there. And so when you look at the projections of what the ocean currents would have looked like in the Paleocene and Oligocene period immediately after the flood, we see that there actually was an ocean current that moved from South America over to Australia. And ironically, ocean currents are argued to be how various creatures got from South America to the famous Galapagos Islands that Darwin studied. So he even used this as an argument. So if a tsunami in one small area of the world could make such a floating island of trees and debris, then what would you expect from a global flood? What kind of debris islands would have been made by that kind of a catastrophic event? And of course, one final possibility as to how you get animals to Australia is that humans could have carried them. Now granted, that's not an option available to evolutionists. They don't believe humans are on the scene yet whenever the animals get out there, but this is not a problem for the flood model. Number 5, according to Bill Nye, you got 16 million species in existence today, 7,000 on the ark. 4,000 years ago, that would require 11 completely new species emerging every day since the flood. And I have to admit, when he first said that, I was like, wow, what's going on there? We got to dig in and figure what's going on here. And I would tell young people, remember, even if you ever hear a quibble that you're like, I don't know what the answer to this is. The answer is not to throw the Bible out, because the Bible already substantiates itself as being from God due to its divine attributes. We went through that on Friday night. So any little quibble like this does not refute, for example, the predictive prophecy of the Bible that proves it has to be from God, and all the classical arguments that have been around for 1,000 years that demand the existence of a God. So all this is an interesting point that we need to dig into and see what's going on here. How do we explain this? So first of all, keep in mind, he's correct in his representation of at least one thing about the flood model. We don't claim that all of the current animal varieties or even species were on the ark. Not every species of dog, for example, was on the ark. Species is a modern concept that's been defined by humans. We argue really what the text says. It uses the word kind, remember. The different kinds of animals were on the ark. We talked about this yesterday, Genesis 6:20, and so we're talking more like a representative of the dog kind from which came domestic dog breeds, but also foxes, wolves, jackals, coyotes, and dingoes that are all acknowledged by creationists to be part of the dog kind. And same thing when we look at the cats. There was probably a representative cat kind from which came all the variety of cats we have today. Same thing with the horse kind, the elephant kind, which is understood by creationists to include the woolly mammoths and mastodons. The camel kind, which even includes the llama, for example, the bear kind. There's a lot of variety there as well. And so you expect a single pair of each of these to be represented on the ark, something more like the modern taxonomic category of family or genus, so representatives of each of these groups. So there's no need to fit every single modern species on the ark, which would be difficult, if not impossible, and no need to, because many different species within a kind could come about through diversification processes that we call microevolution, not macro, which is what Darwin argued for. So there could have been representatives from each of these kinds that had the genetic material to produce all of this diversity of creatures we have within those kinds. So it's true, from those original kinds, the proto-species on the ark, all of the current land and creeping thing species would have emerged through some kind of rapid diversification process. Now, Bill Nye said there were 7,000 proto-species on the ark. He said he was quoting Ken Ham. We don't know if it was 7,000 or not. Creation scientists are looking into that, but we're currently estimating closer to 1,500 general kinds that would have been on the ark. Could have been more or less. But Bill Nye said you'd go into your yard, you wouldn't just find a different bird, a new bird. you'd find a different kind of bird, a whole new species of bird every day. This would be enormous news. I mean, the last 4,000 years, people would have seen these changes among us. We see no evidence of that. There's no evidence of these changes, these species. Notice, by the way, the scoffing attitude that he has. And I warn young people, scoffers intimidate you, even though they're not necessarily saying anything that has any value, any logically doesn't refute anything you believe. But the way they say that as scoffers, there's something intimidating about that, which is exactly what Peter said would happen in 2 Peter 3. In 2 Peter 3, Peter warns there's going to be scoffers, and guess what they're going to scoff at you about? And he lists creation in the flood. And he says they're going to be believers in uniformitarianism. Can you believe that? He actually says that in 2 Peter. He doesn't use that word. He says they're going to say, oh, all things continue as they were from the beginning. He's talking about uniformitarianism. So he warns us, young people in particular, don't be bullied by these guys. Just dig in and see what's going on. Don't be intimidated by this. So in response, first of all, we need to know again, where did he get 16 million for the number of species on the planet? Don't let them say things like that and not prove it. You know, that's what the first thing you got to do when trying to deal with a skeptic. There's a lot of disagreement about how many species there are today. That number is extremely high. Some estimates are as low as 2 million, including an estimate that was published by Science Magazine in 2013. One study from 2011 that's very well researched and accepted by many, so much so that it was published by the Public Library of Science Biology. It estimated not 16 million, but 10,960,000. Keeping in mind that estimate included not only the kingdom Animalia, but plantae, fungi, protozoa, chromista, archaea, and even bacteria. And keep in mind that these are estimates. The actual catalog number of species on the planet 2011 was 1,438,769. They're projecting eventually we're going to find 10,960,000. Now, Bill Nye needs to also accurately reflect the biblical claims. From that 10,960,000 estimate, you have to subtract the marine creatures. They wouldn't have been on the ark. So removing the ocean-dwelling creatures brings us down under 9 million, and possibly other creatures could have survived in the water that could be removed, various amphibians. We'll leave them in there for the sake of argument. Plants, the text doesn't mention plants being taken onto the ark since they aren't flesh, other than those that the passengers would have been eating. That brings you down under 8.5 million. Now, incidentally, would the plants have died in the flood if they're not taken on the ark? And no doubt many certainly would have, like we thought about the trees a moment ago, but not necessarily all of them. Interestingly, many of the planet's plants are in fact underwater today. Roughly half of the Earth's oxygen comes from the ocean. But also seeds could have been brought on the ark, and probably more likely, you consider the seeds that would have been available on all those dead plants floating on the waters of the flood. That would have then, after the recession, regerminated once they came back down and planted on the earth. Studies show that seeds can survive being submersed in salt water for extended periods of time. And ironically, guess who did some of those studies for evolutionary purposes? Darwin. All right, next you have synonymous species, two names given to the same species. Creatures originally thought to be two distinct species, they're now considered one and the same, or one creature whose name has changed over time and yet both names were unintentionally counted. The PLOSB paper highlighted this weakness in species estimates, explaining that a survey of 2,938 taxonomists with expertise across all major domains of life revealed that synonyms are a major problem at the species level. They highlight this weakness and believe that 17.9% of all named species could be synonyms, and possibly much more, as much as 46.6%, nearly half of the species. The World Register of Marine Species documents that 44.5% of all accepted marine species are synonyms. So if we take the lowest estimate of synonymous species for the sake of argument, that only 17.9% of these remaining species are synonyms, that now brings us down under 7 million. Notice this is a far cry from 16 million. Now, if the flood was 4,500 years ago instead of 4,000, which is closer to our estimate, that brings us down to 4 new species a day, not 11 after the flood. Now, if there are fewer species than projections, which is likely, more synonyms, which is virtually certain, more years since the flood, which is possible, more species that could survive outside the ark, which is definite, and more representative kinds on the ark, which also would not be a problem, that number continues to plummet, and we're still not done. Insects, other invertebrates, fungi, protozoa, bacteria, these are all included in that 11 million species, even though many of them wouldn't have been on the ark. God's not sending them to the ark. Invertebrates, for example, make up 95 to 99% of the planet's animal species. Insects alone make up about half of this remaining 6.9 million species. And many of these would have been able to survive outside of the ark, significantly reducing that remaining list, though admittedly some creeping things may have included some of the bugs. Now, of those that are left, keep in mind that there's fast reproductive rates for smaller creatures that could have caused rapid speciation immediately after the flood, the rapid diversification of creatures within the original ark kinds. Flies, for example, can lay as many as 100 eggs a day. According to the American Society for Microbiology, one bacteria can produce 10 billion in 10 hours. Does that bother anybody? So many new species could have been emerging rapidly in these centuries immediately after the flood. So, bottom line, 11 new species a day is nowhere near an accurate assessment of the data. It really either shows a lie on his part or just ignorance on his part. Even 4 would be quite an overestimate, and most of those would be tiny creatures completely unnoticed by humans, even though Bill Nye claimed that this rapid speciation would have been noticed by humans. When you consider the fact that the earth has a volume of over 1 trillion cubic kilometers, humans only inhabit a tiny space on the earth comparatively, and therefore we're just not in a position to know what all is going on or in the earth. The odds that a species would happen to evolve in your backyard and you notice it, much less that it would be large enough for you to see it, is essentially zero. But even in spite of that, here's the ironic thing. According to the literature, scientists are still discovering for the first time 15,000 new species every year that they've never noticed before. Guess how many that is every day? 41. 41 new species are being discovered every day. Number 6, according to Bill Nye, the National Zoo exhibits 400 species, and it takes 163 acres to do it. So how could the ark hold 14,000 people? Well, it's uncertain even whether 14,000 creatures would be a good estimate of the representative proto-species on the ark, but let's go with it for the sake of argument. Number 1, the ark and the zoo aren't really a good parallel, are they? I mean, because the ark isn't about display, it's about basic shelter. And so a better parallel would be maybe a factory farm or high-density housing facility, which can house tens of thousands of animals in tight quarters under a single roof. Number 2, if the cubit is about 18 inches, what most scholars estimate, so from the length from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger, the ark would have been about 450 feet long, so a football field and a half long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet high. Creation geologist and biologist John Woodmarab did an extensive study on how much space would be required to house 16,000 animals, not just 14,000. So this is representatives of each of the genii, and he took into account food, water, waste disposal, heating, ventilation, and lighting, and found that the ark was more than adequate in size to house the animals on that sized ark. If you get to go to the Ark Encounter in northern Kentucky, really you just start walking up on it and you're just like, oh, okay, well that answers a lot of questions when you see the size of this vessel. But consider also, what if humans were generally larger in the pre-flood era due to better health and life longevity? Because you already have enormous reptiles in the pre-flood world as well as enormous plants, and we have evidence immediately after the flood, remember, of Homo heidelbergensis, which are these huge humans that seem to be, remember, not an anomaly, we talked about this yesterday, but seem to be characteristic of a lot of humans at the time. That may have been more like what pre-flood man was like. So what if the cubit was larger than 18 inches, which some estimates actually make it? A 25-inch versus an 18-inch cubit, for example, more than doubles the volume of space on the ark, from 1.5 million cubic feet to 4 million cubic feet. Now, of course, we can also reason that the animals likely would not have been full-sized animals. They likely would have been juvenile. Why? Well, smaller animals are going to take up less space. They're going to eat less food, assuming they're not in a hibernative state, and make less waste. But more importantly, younger animals are going to live longer after the flood to be able to repopulate the planet. So it makes sense that God would want the juveniles on the arks. They're going to live longer, be able to repopulate the planet afterwards. So Bill Nye's criticism doesn't disprove the Bible. It actually gives it another chance to shine when we think about it. What about the dinosaurs, though? Would the dinosaurs have been on the ark? Well, this is one theory about what's going on there. Creation scientists know with a high degree of confidence where the flood begins in the geologic strata. We think it's the Cambrian strata. And the dinosaurs are found above that in the flood layers. And we know they're still alive because we find their footprints, which means if they're land-dwelling creatures, they're represented on the ark. So how do we explain dinosaurs being on the ark? Well, keep in mind the average size of an adult dinosaur is about the size of an American bison. Okay, so you tend to think of the big massive ones, but the average size is not that big. And again, juvenile forms are likely. I've got a replica, for example, of a titanosaur egg at AP. It's about this big. So even the big titanosaur that ends up being as big as this building starts out in an egg this big. So the juvenile forms would help to make it where even the dinosaurs, of which there's probably about 35 representative kinds among the dinosaurs we're thinking right now. This, by the way, dispels virtually any criticism that you might have. Here's the full-length replica of the ark up in northern Kentucky. And this is me with a bunch of my family and friends, and that's us right over there. All right, this shows you how big this vessel is. All right, number 7, Bill Nye cited the Wyoming and said the Wyoming was this big wooden vessel built in 1909. It sank in 1924 due to the tendency of its long wooden planks to twist and buckle on the heavy seas. So if you've got wooden planks that tend to twist and buckle on a vessel that large, wouldn't an even larger vessel be unseaworthy? So how do we explain that? Number one, as with the ark and the zoo, the Wyoming and the ark are not a good parallel. The Wyoming had masts and sails. This would have created immense torsion from the wind filling those sails on the open seas. It definitely would have caused twisting and buckling. The ark, of course, wouldn't have had sails because it didn't need to go anywhere. I can't believe that Bill Nye, as an engineer, even brought this argument up. It's a terrible argument. The torsion problem would have been greatly reduced by the ark not having sails. Also, large ancient wooden vessels have been found dating back to immediately after the flood in Egypt, and they were equipped with a sophisticated interlocking plank system called the mortise and tenon joint. Mortise and tenon joints are known to help prevent twisting and provide added strength to the frame, and yet they're doing this immediately after the flood. I would argue this is evidence of pre-flood advanced technology that survived the flood through Noah and his family. Seaworthy, large wooden ships were not out of question for the ancients. Number 3, no one knows what gopher wood was, and God was very specific in choosing this wood for the ark. Moses mentioned several other specific species of wood in the Pentateuch that we know what they are: terebinth, green poplar, almond, palm, willow, olive, fig, pomegranate, and chestnut. And many others are mentioned in Scripture outside of the Pentateuch. God chose this mysterious gopher, and there may be no modern equivalent to it. In fact, there wouldn't be when you consider the fact that many pre-flood trees likely went extinct, and even those that didn't would have been subject to the same genetic entropy that everything else has been subject to. Everything is deteriorating. Remember, second law of thermodynamics. So it's unlikely that we have an equivalent wood today to gopher wood. It was clearly chosen because it was conducive to God's instructions for the ark. Noah wasn't coming up with this on his own. God told him what to use. Number 4, notice the Wyoming, in spite of its problems, stayed afloat for 15 years. The ark only needed to stay afloat for a few months. So bottom line, Bill Nye didn't show the ark to be unseaworthy. Quite the contrary. These accusations, again, give the creation model an opportunity to shine. Interestingly, The dimensions of the ark have been shown to produce a seaworthy vessel. The SS Great Britain, in service from 1845 to 1886, had a dimension ratio of 322 to 51 to 32, almost exactly that of the ark. World War II, you had a group of ships constructed, nicknamed the Ugly Ducklings, and similar to the ark, they were cargo ships. They weren't built for speed or combat, but just to transport a lot of stuff through the harsh sea. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien, for example, had a length to width to height dimension ratio, very similar to the ark when you make the conversions of the ark into feet. You have the most recently designed super jumbo barges, which again are better parallels to the ark. Their purpose is just to stay afloat while they transport immense amounts of cargo. And again, these dimensions, very similar to the ark. The oil tankers, the very large crude oil carriers, the VLCC, length to width to height, again, very close to the ark's dimension ratio. Modern cruise ships can be comparable as well. So you notice a trend. If you want to build a big boat that's intended to haul enormous amounts of material, the best design is to use a length to width to height ratio like that of the ark. Now, how in the world would that have been known thousands of years ago? Well, I think we know. I mean, number one, Noah's no amateur. He's hundreds of years old whenever he starts building this vessel. He probably knew exactly how to do certain things with ships. And on top of that, he's got God telling him what to do. So Bill and I brought up several other points that I address in that Reason and Revelation, which you can get back there for free or go to our website and check this out as well. So basically, you know, creationists are a bunch of ignorant hillbillies, so I don't know what you're even doing here. So thank you for your attention.